wasn't a total month for industrial action reasons, but Steph's kindly agreed to come here today to share with you the what worked well, what didn't work so well, and really go through in quite detail what happened in Halvar very recently and what their next steps are really. So if it's okay with you, Steph, I'm going to hand straight over. I don't know whether Ken's on the call, if he wanted to say anything first, but if not, I will hand straight over to Stephanie Heyer.
Thanks, Loretta. It's afternoon. Yes, it is. I've been a busy day already. Okay, so my role is I am the General Manager for Scheduled Care for Halvar. And certainly probably towards the back end of January, middle of February this year. Obviously, we're working in collaboration with Swansea Bay around the regional orthopaedic programme. But certainly from our point of view in Halvar, we had some very long waits still in orthopaedics. And so Corinna, who's on the call, came in from the NHS exec to support us, share the good practice from North Wales, and we were encouraged to look at whether we could do, and it was going to be a perfect month until, as Loretta said, there was industrial action planned, but we got through the 3 weeks. It was quite short notice. It was a very difficult time of year for us because we were trying to bring in year end as well, which is always difficult for everybody. But I was asked to be the project lead, which was fine. And I'll try and take you through our journey and where we're at the moment. So, okay, I think that Lisa's actually, she's doing the next slide. Lovely. So this is quite a lengthy slide, so I'll try and make it as seamless as I can. And then if there's any questions, it's probably better we stick to them at the end, if that's okay. So the presentation scope, you can see, was quite big, to be fair. So we will try and walk through that through the presentation. It's probably easier to do that. So next slide, Lisa. So there you are. It's just tells you a little bit of the background. I've gone through that, how we got there. So next slide, Lisa. Okay, so this is one of our performance slides. It's a submitted Welsh Government slide, end of month RTT performance. Takes us up until the end of February 24, but obviously we've not long submitted. I think it was Monday this week we submitted end of March, and that position that we ended up with was 36 patients still waiting over 4 years, and it was around 170 odd that were waiting over the 3 years, and obviously we've got the 104 cohort in stage 4. So this slide, if we're expected to present this anywhere else, we'll update that as it becomes available. Next slide. Okay, so what we tried to look at, we tracked our orthopaedic activity back to pre-COVID. Certainly when we discussed this this presentation last week at the executive brief within Halvar, which some of the colleagues on here were actually at that presentation, you know, they identified the level of activity in 2019 pre-COVID, where actually we were running orthopaedic theatres across 3 sites. We currently only run inpatient orthopaedics across 2 sites, which is Prince Philip and Bronglais. We've got more of a day surgery focus at Withybush because obviously there's been issues there, as most people will know if they've seen it, around the rack situation and inpatient arthroplasty work, because they weren't in a position to provide a protected elective unit, was removed probably around mid-COVID from Withybush, and that we're in a position in Withybush. We're trying to look at a high volume short stay centre at the moment. That work is ongoing. So as you can see, there was a real dip in our activity across 21, 22 and even in 23, and now it's started to pick back up. So again, this only takes you till the end of February because these slides will need to be updated. This was updated probably, the information was put in probably about 2 weeks ago. Next slide, Lisa. So this just gives you a flavour of what the summary treatment basket was that we looked at. Certainly, probably good to say that there was a huge amount of work and a range of people across the whole multidisciplinary team who were pulled together to look at actually being able to provide the perfect month, and certainly from a point of view of pulling the patients off the PTL, And the other thing is that how sort of the patient journey was recorded, but I'll go into that in a bit in the KPIs. But you can see the split out was predominantly hip and knee replacements with some smaller cases. But we've already sort of started to look at the amount of carpal tunnels we actually have got on our current list, and also the ones that were treated. So I think that's sort of self-explanatory. And I would be confident enough to say that the injections and arthroscopies that are on there have already gone through the INU procedure, and that we continue to look at the INU validation on a very regular basis within the health board. Next slide, Lisa. Okay, so this is a bit about how we did it, and I'm sorry if I'm boring the people from the north who actually have done this before and done it very successfully, but we tried to replicate some of the work that you've done. So we brought all the relevant stakeholders together as a project team. One of the most important things we looked at was the entire patient pathway, including our therapy leads, our wards, our HSDU, our waiting list, our pre-assessment, our ops teams, our professional leads, certainly because patient experience, staff experience, and we actually tried very quickly to get the scope of the project identified, the terms of reference, and obviously the responsibilities of the people within that project team. One of the big things that caused a lot of discussion and some angst as well, really, was the key performance indicators, because there were very different thoughts on what they should actually be. And certainly as we've walked ourselves through this project, we would definitely be looking at a smaller range of KPIs that were easier to monitor, but also that could be automated. So that's something that we're looking at, because a lot of the data that we had to collect either wasn't available within the system, or indeed the new theatre dashboard, purely because it was quite detailed information, and some of it was collected manually. So just so you know that. You can see the work streams that were developed. There was a range of them. Obviously the clinical, the nursing, the data, particularly the staff and patient feedback, that was important to us. Therapies, pre-assessment, waiting list, ward staff and HSDU. And what we did originally, we met twice a week to get this off the ground. That was a large commitment for the staff that were involved. It was a really wide group of people to manage in a project team. But in fairness, most people came together really well. There were people who were sceptical of the process, but in the end, we managed to get everybody onto the same page, and that we actually wanted to get the purpose of and the scope of the project. I think that everybody felt that they understood it, that was in the project team. Actually communicating that out to the wider team was much more of a challenge because of our geography, and we were running this over the 3 sites. It just wasn't Prince Philip, it was Withybush and Brongleis, but we got on and did that. So next slide please, Lisa. There were the key objectives. I mean, I think I've sort of chatted some of those through, but the very key objectives were in particular to support the RTT recovery, and indeed it did make a big impact on the amount of patients that we had waiting at the end of February to the amount of patients we had ending at the end of March. Certainly, Loretta has been into our organisation. Corinna was already in. We've to looking at theatre utilisation and throughput, and certainly they were welcomed from a point of view of giving us some different ideas and new ideas about how we could actually work. But the whole purpose of this was to actually maximise any theatres that we had that were functioning as orthopaedic theatres, increase the amount of sessions available, but not just to increase the sessions, it was actually to utilise the sessions in a better way. Obviously, like everybody else, we've aligned it to the GIRF recommendations. And certainly it's really interesting that even across other specialties, they are now asking questions about what came out of this perfect months, from a point of view of how they can align it to their own GIRF recommendations for their specialty. So I think that's really useful. One of the other things that we brought back, I think, because certainly I've been working in the NHS quite a long time, and we were always used to having a standby list within our waiting list. But what we actually escalated that to was having a standby patient. So actually, if we thought there was an ability to be able to add a patient to a list, dependent how that list was going that day, there would be a conversation between the anaesthetist and the surgeon and the teams as to whether they thought they could increase the capacity on the list. And we identified patients who were very well briefed. There was obviously a SOP put together, and we actually were able to treat quite a few standby patients during this process. So that is certainly something that is continuing into this month. We're continuing with that, and we'll continue to audit that. We looked at reducing hospital-initiated cancellations, again about patient experience and the staff morale and experience, because I do think that particularly staff who've worked in orthopaedics have had a very difficult time, because really they did have a very large hit during COVID and certainly in the recovery from COVID. We wanted to demonstrate value. I mean, at the end of the day, we are spending public money every day and treating our patients, so we want to do that well. But there's also value in quality and outcomes that we wanted to make sure that we were able to provide for our patients, and so that certainly was looked at. We always want to learn. Everybody wants to learn. It doesn't matter, you know, how long you've been here or how things have always been done. We do need to understand that things could change, and certainly we needed. That was one of the focuses of the project group, was trying to encourage people to sort of understand that they could change. It wasn't always the best that we did all of the time, because certainly there was a way to do it differently. And again, just aligning every step in the stage 4 pathway to improve effectiveness. And it's very interesting when you unpick the stage 4 pathway, it looks very easy. Certainly my colleagues on here across the regions, I mean, to be honest, I think the stage 4 pathway is very complicated. There's different slots of it. And I think there's a lot that can be done to streamline it. So we've started that learning process. Next slide, please. Some of the key performance indicators, and this is just an example, there was a lot more than this, and this is why we're looking at trying to hone them down, was increasing the sessions, increasing the number of patients, theatre throughput, reduce the fallow time, turnaround time, late starts, early finishes. One of the big ones that caused quite a lot of consternation, lots of discussion, was the team briefs time at 8:15. That was quite a change for this organisation. To continue to do that all of the time, we're going to have to look at some of our job planning and some of the way that we actually bring patients in on the day. We brought them in much earlier than what they were actually coming in. And again, it's making sure that the anaesthetist and the consultant agree on what that time that team brief and when it's successful. But we've got some evidence of that later on. And certainly from a therapies perspective, we had a lot of feedback, and they were really, really helpful. And they actually, even this team that were working out of Prince Philip, they extended and helped out to Bronglice from an advice perspective, because it was around how many patients could we mobilise on the day of surgery. So there's some interesting outcomes of that. Next slide. So this is just an example of patients and sessions, and you can see the perfect month highlighted on the right-hand side of each of these tables. I've explained that the sites were the 3 sites. Certainly looked at how many patients potentially were cancelled. It was around 5 per week. We've got the reasons for the cancellation. A very crude calculation of that from day case and inpatient is around 2.2, 2.5 during the perfect months. And we've taken that from our Power BI dashboard. And as I said, that'll be updated on a regular basis. So we should be able to see whether the impact has stayed or whether we've dipped. And the whole point of us is now going into, and Corinna will understand this, and Keith, is into some type of battle rhythm to keep this going. So that's really important to us. Next slide. So these are some of the reasons for cancellations, some of them patient related, some of them health board and operational. Again, always taken from our informatics source. So it was things like patients deemed unfit. All these are being explored in an action tracker. Patients said they were pain-free, not happy to proceed. They decided they didn't want the procedure. There was a high-risk complex patient. And then obviously one where a drug hadn't been stopped. So all of those things we will unpick, because then that'll be useful for our own learning. They're being unpicked at the moment. And then more of the operational issues, where there was a theatre overrun. There was an issue with the stack system. There's a patient listed for an incorrect procedure, so that's being investigated at the moment. And then there's 2 that weren't specified. So there are quite a varying amount of different things around the cancellations. Next slide. Okay, so this was the actual theatre utilisation. The planned sessions included the AM and PM are all day, and around the minutes that are counted for that. The patient end time minus the anaesthetic time is the methodology, and all the calculations, I will say, are crude averages. So you can see in the perfect months that the actual average planned session duration did vary just slightly, as did and it was interesting how we peaked in the middle week because it was over the 3 weeks, and you felt that peak in the project team as well. But I think one of the things that I think is important about that is that we did a huge amount of work with pre-assessment in the lead up to it, but we also had some different theatre issues, which were localised theatre issues that probably created that slight dip in the 3rd week. But other than that, from a theatre utilisation, there was an improvement for us. We felt there was an improvement. Next slide. So these are some of the reasons that we captured around late start, early finishes. I'm sure they're familiar to most people. Either the surgeon was late or the anaesthetist was late. We experienced some of this in the 1st week because there was felt that some people hadn't been communicated well enough. So we rectified that. We did a lot of what I would say retrospective discussion yet again with particularly the anaesthetic group. A lot of them had been on leave while we were working it up. Some of them said they didn't understand the perfect month. So there was lots of the communication needed to keep going. There was a continuous churn. So we could try and improve some of these as we went along. You can see there was an overrun, patient not ready. One of our things was surgeons seeing other patients, especially in the Withybush part of this, because they run it through the day surgery, because at the moment we don't have any inpatient beds. So they could be down in the day surgery seeing a patient, but those patients could be channeled up through main theatre. So there would be a delay, and that's one of the areas where we will need to pull the start times and the patient coming in times coming back on a consistent basis, because it was done as part of the project. And then the early finishes, there was 24, so everything was completed. And then there was cancellation, so that was actually on the day. So next slide, please. I think this slide is really interesting. This was, as I said, the one that probably was of the most interest to every clinician, and did cause a little bit of angst. But you can see the average team brief time. So realistically, any time between 8:15 to 8:30, there was around the 20. Obviously, mostly focused at Prince Philip because that's our biggest part that the orthopaedic goes through the elective. And then it was interesting how the 8:30 to 9 was captured, and so there was 54. After 9 o'clock, I didn't feel that, yes, there are some, but they were for varying reasons that we could identify. And then actually everybody got very excited at some point, and then they started doing the team brief before 8:15. And that was when the enthusiasm, I would say, was at its highest, to be fair. Next slide. The anaesthetic start times, again, something that is always discussed around theatre utilisation. Again, you can see the varying times around that. Majority, though, in the hundreds between the 8:30 to the 9 o'clock slot, and then 9 till 9:15. And there were 45 after, from this slide, which takes us from the right through. It was difficult. So in the weeks of the perfect month, we could actually see that I felt that there was some real improvement within the 8:30 to 9 slot. So I think that was just useful. So again, the data is only as good as the data that's entered. And that's where we did struggle with some of the manual data, but that's something we need to put right as a health board, because this was a project. Next slide, Lisa. Another slide showing last patient out of theatre. This is important about finish times. You can see again that in the weeks of the perfect month, generally we had 9 that were out between 4 and 5. Some of them, the 3 till 4 one, there was the 49. We've started drilling into some of that further as to whether that's in the day surgery part or whether that was the inpatient. But there were some patients that were complex. We decided not to bring a standby patient in and actually probably could have put a small case in. So again, that was the learning for us. But the fact that sort of the 36% were between 4 and 5, that was felt that it was reasonable. It's not as good as we can be because we've still got things to learn, but it's better than where we were. Next slide. This is an important slide for me around the therapies. As I said, they were exceptionally engaged. That was physio, OT, working with us, working with pre-assessment. We also engaged our WLSS service and also prehab. But this just shows that where they audited the patients and how many they actually mobilised on day 0 and the reasons they couldn't mobilise them. There was issues around patients who were later back from theatre, but I think that we had the discussion, do we look at a different way of staffing our physio, in particular physio requirements on the ward? Do we need that physio there later in the day rather than first thing? Do we need to extend the physio cover? Because actually then you've got an opportunity to mobilise. I think on day 0, I think we also, just to note that there was some different practice that took place in bronchitis, particularly around pain relief, and they still do use drains in bronchitis. That's their clinical preference. But certainly I think the work across the health board started to rub off. And what we actually did was we had a check back meeting every day at 10 o'clock. And I think that everybody got so engaged in, we'd ask about every patient, whether they'd be mobilised, whether they were up in the chair, whether, what was their plan for home. And it sort of got to the point that it was almost felt like, well, my patients are going home. It was a little bit like an internal competition, which it doesn't do any harm in the long run, to be fair. But I have to say the engagement from therapies was excellent. So just to feed that back. Next slide, please. And this is just some of their feedback, really, and some of the work that we're continuing to look at. So, and it's interesting. So around patients, so patients' perspective of their maximum length of stay, how long they think they need to stay when you're trying to get them home, their expectation for hospital transport. There were small things like some patients said they didn't get a booklet in pre-assessment. Bearing in mind these patients, they go through process with the WLSS service, they go through prehab, they do have conversations, they forget all that because all they can focus on is they need to be in hospital for a while. There was a lot of extra work that was done by staff purely because it was needed to make the project work. I think if we were going to continue, from a point of view of the intensity that this was, we would need to consider how all the areas continue to be staffed. It doesn't mean that we've stopped, but the absolute intensity there was between this, it will require some additional staffing, particularly around some of the therapy work. There was a huge difference in staff morale and the way that they started to talk about work, and they all started engaging with each other. And certainly from a ward perspective, we saw a dynamic atmosphere in Prince Philip. And certainly what I felt with because it's a day surgery in Withybush, so it's slightly different. But in bronchitis, they became very motivated, and they felt that they wanted to be on the same page as Prince Philip Ward 6, which it's really, really good for us. And in fact, it's really interesting post this is they're actually remaining engaged through Teams. They want to ask questions. So I think that's really, really positive because, at the end of the day, we want everybody to feel included. We had a few equipment issues. We certainly had a stem issue. Probably anybody else who does orthopedics may have had the long stem issue with the supply across Wales, and we were helped out with that, which was great. Some of the other things were family support. Families want their relatives to stay in hospital because they've had a massive operation. know they can actually go home on the same day. So there was lots of different messaging that needed to be changes, and they've said about the long days. And they did have a band 4 support in the therapies, and that was really beneficial. So they wanted us to feed that back. Next slide. So pre-assessment, and I accept there's going to be a sin across Wales around pre-assessment, and I think it's well needed. Our needs are no different to anybody else. Certainly our colleagues have just come off a meeting with Swansea Bay around orthopaedics. It's not unusual. From a point of view is that you have patients generally on either repeat, because they've been waiting such a long time, repeat appointments, or indeed repeat test appointments. So there was a lot of work done with pre-assessment. We continue to do work on pre-assessment. It's not in any way completely resolved. And it's interesting how we've started to look at the weight, and we want, because if we're going to forward plan, which is what we're doing for orthopaedics, we need to have that 3 months window where patients are ready, and we've got a backlog that we need to clear. So certainly we've had that conversation with Corinna, we've had it with Loretta, and we're looking at how we can improve our pre-assessment, but that will be backed up by the anaesthetic pre-assessment SIN that's being set up. But you can see from the table there, and I'm happy to share these slides, or Lisa will, if anybody wants the detail, but it is quite interesting on the amount of test appointments. The other thing about this is that most of these patients were major surgeries, so do they need a full pre-assessment? Probably yes, but there was a proportion that were minor surgery, list fillers, with whichever way we cut it, and could they have just had a screening appointment? So there's lots of different things for us to learn around the pre-assessment. Next slide. This is sort of it's a nice slide. This is a staff feedback. We set up QR codes, so the staff on a regular basis, and this was taken, obviously, bearing in mind, probably about 2 weeks ago. We've had more responses since. It's an honest assessment. We took the criticism as well as the positives. You can see some of them that people felt that what worked well was the team brief, the problem solving, the collaboration, the utilisation, the staff engagement, and what could have been improved. Staff did feel pressured to actually perform and make sure that it worked. They were very clear in that feedback. There were equipment issues. And then there were a group of staff who felt they hadn't been communicated with, but they didn't attend the Teams meetings either while we were setting it up, and you do end up in that Teams meeting. So I think what we're still sifting through the responses, because as I said, they're still coming in. And when we keep going now, we think it's worthwhile doing this on a regular basis with staff anyway. So that's some of the stuff that we had. I think the fact that 70% felt there was a notable improvement in collaborative working and 77% in productivity, I think is felt that was helpful to us. Okay, next slide. These are some of the feedbacks via email. You can see people were impressed with the team as a whole. They had better job satisfaction, felt more motivated. HSDU, they worked really hard. They gave some great feedback. They enjoyed it. They felt that they felt part of the team, and we only had one HSDU incident, which was very minor in Withybush, and then they just rectified it. So it was really helpful to have them. And then again, it was the motivation within the MDT. They wanted to actually feedback. These are just samples. Next slide, Lisa. So this was the patient feedback. So obviously on the left, there's some items. I'll go through that. But the interesting part for Hywel Dda, because I've referenced the geography, is certainly the mileage travelled, because patients came. So Pembrokeshire patients were going to Bronglais to be treated. Because if they needed joints, there were patients from Pembrokeshire coming up to Prince Philip, and vice versa. If they needed shorter day surgery work, we could do it at Withybush. And there really wasn't, there were a fair percentage of people who went 30 to 40 miles to have their operation. And there wasn't really that much concern about travelling that. Some of the other things we pulled out, and we've had actually been in our directorate quality meeting this morning, is because we're doing the SIP to send for day surgery, is, I think one of the frightening things in this for us, and we acknowledge it, is the nil by mouth position, where you've got patients who've been nil by mouth for 8 hours plus. I picked that up in the executive brief as well. I understand that there's a Royal College guidance coming out around anaesthetics, around SIP to send for actual patients going to main theatre quite shortly. So that'll be really, really helpful, because we shouldn't be in that position. So that was, I mean, that's honest feedback. And then we had 80% of patients that felt very satisfied, which is useful, but it's also useful for us to understand why they didn't feel satisfied. So certainly there's some elements of it there. Some patients felt obviously welcomed and orientated onto the ward. And the important one for me that's in that list is that the 10 out of 11 of the standby patients didn't feel the distance they had to travel influenced their decision to accept or decline the offer. There are other things that I could pull out of there that sort of were reflections from our patients. And certainly they, you know, some said they didn't understand the length of stay, but 79% did. So that was useful. Next slide, Lisa, please. This again is a similar slide we have for the staff. This is, you know, some of the things what they felt was helpful. In the green, friendly, welcoming, professional, great communication, really good feedback for some of the sites. And then what can be improved? Certainly there was an issue around medication. Pharmacy were in our project team, but there were some delays in medication, so that's something we need to look at. Physiotherapy information came up on one of the sites as well, and there was something about explanation of the process prior to surgery, so we need to pick that up. But we did have really good patient feedback. We also had some unpleasant feedback, because you would always get that, because it's a channel for people, and there was some sterling feedback as well, so it's where you take the measure in the middle, really. Next slide, Lisa, please. There were some limitations for us. Obviously it meant shuffling around some of the specialties. We're still working through that. We want to be able to provide the 20 sessions that we have in Prince Philip. We want to provide high volume work at Withybush with an inpatient facility as well. But for this project, we were prioritising orthopaedics, but it didn't stop us actually getting to the target that we expected to get to, and bettering it in the other specialties as well. So there's something about that. Some of the work was done by WLI. It's the ongoing ability to do that. And certainly we had to look at booked leave to be able to facilitate, and we did carry some leave over. So that's just important to note. There were issues around some of the recording in the WPAS system. They're things we're working through with our informatics colleagues at the moment. And one of the things I probably haven't handed over is we actually put in three theatre drivers, we called them. But they weren't just theatres. There was a senior driver on each site, which was a senior nurse manager, who actually managed the process, whether it was the ward, HSDU, linking in with waiting lists, sorting out the standby patient. They were the go-to person every day. And we are at the moment trying to work out how we can actually do that within our current footprint of staff, because it really, really worked. Again, it's about the patient's start time, you know, coming in a bit earlier. So we need to work out how we can do that. And we know that we need to improve our theatre dashboard. It's not a secret. And also just to note that the all-day session at the moment in the dashboard counts as 1 rather than 2. So they were some of our things that we picked up. Next slide. I've just talked about this, the lessons learned. We have to have a senior driver within each theatre suite that covers the range. Assigning a theatre porter to collect the patients. Patients walk into theatre when they could save time. The standby list was brilliant. It worked really well. We do need to improve our weekend physio. The patient discharge on day 0, that'll take a little bit more working on, but it can be done. Pre-assessment I've talked about. And then obviously wasted less theatre time due to the patient standby list. The whole process, yes, it renewed focus and it had very positive outcomes. Continuing that positivity is a lesson that has to be learned. And quite frankly, running that every day can get very, very tiring for the people who are in it, but it has to be done. And it's how now we roll that out across other specialties and the rest of our theatre suites. And I think that may be it, Lisa, is it? Yeah. So there you go. Whistle stop talk.
Oh, thanks, Steph, and thanks to you and your team. I know it was an incredible piece of work, and as you said, you know, in a short period of time. So I'll open it up to any questions from the team, if that's, or the people on the call, if that's okay. Any questions for Steph? Paul?
Oh, hi. Stephanie, that was excellent. That was a great presentation, and it's lovely to see how well that worked. Just a couple of things from me. Sorry, I'm General Manager for Perioperative Care at Cardiff and Vale. You talked a lot about the planning stage. How long did that stage take? What was that planning stage? How long did it take just to run this perfect month?
So my colleague and my manager, Mr. Jones, is on here. And I came back probably, I've been off for a period myself, and I came back and I would say it was the 15th of February.
Yeah.
And we started on the 4th of March. That was the planning time we had to turn it around. But in fairness, Corinna supported us all the way, and obviously Keith's extremely supportive. It took a huge amount of work, but everybody pulled together to do it. I would advise, if somebody was going to look at it, that they take a little bit longer, but not too long, because people lose the focus.
So you had a dedicated team with protected time to do this?
No, I did my GM job as well.
Okay.
So no. Thank you, Paul.
Keith?
Yeah, thanks, Steph, for responding to that. Yeah, just to contextualize that a bit more. In an ideal set of circumstances, one would plan this for a greater lead-in time, yeah, given the learning that we've drawn from the exercise. I'm sure Rhys will have his own perspective from the work in North Wales. There was a bit of an imperative for us, though, and there were two primary objectives here, and there may have been a third, but there's certainly two primary operational objectives. One, of course, was making sure that we were in a position to hit the ground running from the start of this year, taking the learning from the exercise. But also we had that operational imperative of leaving no stone unturned to maximise every operating opportunity that we could possibly identify to reduce our year-end cohort of longest waiting patients. Yeah. So yeah, ideally we'd take a longer run at it, but there was a bit of a needs must for us from that perspective as well, given that, you know, we knew it would give us a significant contribution to our year-end objectives as well. Yeah, so it's a bit of a mixed thought process in terms of where we ended up running at it. Nonetheless, as you hopefully picked up from the feedback that Steph has shared, we've still gleaned a huge amount of learning from it. So I guess there'd always be a reason not to do it. Yeah, and part of me thinks, well, just bite the bullet anyway, because you'll get something from the process. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. Two other questions from me, if I may. You talked about cancellations and you had an action tracker. Where are those actions discussed? How are they escalated and who are they escalated to? Do you actually go to each of the specialty managers within each of the specialties or the specialisms within? And what are you hoping to gain from that?
So I think, Paul, the first thing was that we set up this daily meeting of an abridged project team, but it had representation from all of the site, the theatre drivers. So what we did a look back every day, and if there had been cancellations the day before, the obviously it's one ops team who look after orthopedics. We would ask them to look at it, why they were cancelled, was there a reason? So there was an active process going on. That was exactly the same mind if a theatre list finished early. There was all the questions that were asked. And from those, some of those things are still being investigated because they're I suppose, anomalies in a way, some of them as well. But we've also found that a lot of patients who've been waiting a long time who present for pre-assessment, they potentially aren't fit when they present, but sometimes they get through pre-assessment and then they're not fit, still not fit on the day. So it's an ongoing thing for us.
Okay, thank you. And last one from me, is there a plan to roll this out to other specialties?
Oh, Right, okay. So in my head, yes, but from a planning perspective, it's going to take a bit more time. We've still got things to get right in orthopedics. So we accept there are other specialties that would benefit by it. But I think Keith's quite right that we need to be a little bit more measured. We need to understand the time that it takes and perhaps have a bit longer of a lead-in time. But I want to get this one completely right, because 3 weeks is 3 weeks. If we can do it for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and even a year, that's different for me.
Thank you.
Just before I bring Reese in, I'll just bring Keith in because I assume he wants to answer that point.
Yeah, in fairness, Steph has probably covered it. In fairness,
Okay.
So Paul, absolutely, the ambition is there. Now, some of that learning will be transferable in the short term. Yeah, so we can apply some of those lessons right across the board from the get-go to some extent. The engagement piece needs that lead-in time, I think, with the individual specialties. Yeah, so that's the bit. So if you're going to repeat the exercise in another specialty, I think I wouldn't underestimate the engagement bit. Yeah,
Okay.
But applying the learning, there are opportunities to do that now straight away from a system and process perspective.
Thank you so much, Keith.
Thanks both. Reese?
I think hats off for pulling that off over multiple sites, because I think I can see Keely on the call. I think it's hard enough doing it on one site, and not to underestimate the amount of effort that's got to go in to maintain that level of concentration and focus and positivity throughout a month when you're actually really challenging everybody in that team to really max out their own personal bandwidth and sanity. I think from our perspective, there are a couple of interesting to see. You've got, I think some of the issues you've encountered are obviously going to be common. Comms is probably the single biggest challenge in pulling this off. So good communication, interdisciplinary communication within the team is absolutely critical, because you've got to get everybody onto the same page in terms of what can be achieved and then be delivered. I think the challenge for us has been in sustaining that. So there was an awful lot of learning that came out of the exercise. What it probably identified is some of our investment requirements going forward. So if we want to run a service at that level every month forever, we are going to have to increase the level of investment that goes in, and that's not necessarily directly in to consultants or orthopod posts, but it will be things like POAC. You know, one of the biggest challenges is having a large pool of people that you can pull from, so that you haven't got any sort of delays in flow. And the other bit, we very nearly ran out of consumables. So the one bit that I think we hadn't clocked is if you're going to up your number of procedures, you've got to up your consumable stock holding, because everybody is trying to claw back a backlog, and there are only finite stocks available. So we did have a period of time where we thought we were going to run out of cement and various kits. So just a few reflections from us. I think what we take from that is the learning. We take that into our Abergele, and ultimately Llandudno service model. So the way that we ran in Wrexham is the blueprint for how we should be running all the time, and it's given us a blueprint really now. So a bit of a roadmap as to where we go next. The one thing that we did do when Karina left us was to have an orthopedic battle rhythm. So there's a weekly meeting with the ops managers, not necessarily around the perfect month, but actually there are principles that the perfect month taught us that we've been able to incorporate into routine delivery, but just maintaining that oversight and support for the teams, I think, is probably, from our perspective, one of the biggest positives that's come out of that. So we have increased our overall throughput by dint of behaving in that way, of the way we had to pull off a perfect month. I don't know if there's anything, Keely, you would want to pick up by way of experience.
No, just well done. It is extremely challenging, and it can't be underestimated how difficult that challenge is. So well done. Yeah, lots of learning, similar themes coming through there, Stephanie. But yeah, no, I think it's all been summarised. It would be interesting though to run it outside of orthopedics in a different specialty. Not that I'm suggesting I'm a volunteer for that. but definitely interesting to see it across a range of specialties.
We should all do it at the same time in Wales on a specialty, and then you'd see what would happen. I think that'd be really interesting. Same window of time.
I think the big learning for us, I mean, Rhys, you're absolutely right, is investment in the workforce. A lot of the perfect month was on goodwill, which cannot be sustainable, and nor should it be. We should be absolutely investing in our resource and infrastructure for the future demands of the service. So yes, we do know there's a significant gap in our certainly our theatre establishment, so lots to learn from that.
Thanks both. And just before I bring Joanne in, I think it's just important to note that what we know that what's happened to planned care across Wales is that money has beds, facilities, some elective lists have moved out of planned care into other areas. And I think that has to be understood as well, because when you build and you create additional consultants, you should be building as part of that what you require to be a productive department. And I think part of that challenge was that money has moved out of planned care to support a variety of different things, and we need to ensure that balance is returned to some degree. So I'll just bring Joanne in now.
Thanks, Loretta. A fantastic piece of work, everyone. No doubt South East Wales will be picking your brains in the next coming months to come. So just a couple of questions regarding sustainability. How have you found keeping the daily team brief going? Have you been able to keep the momentum? Because I understand when something new happens, it often dips and it's hard to keep the passion and the momentum going to keep that on. And also you referred to the theatre drivers that are a senior member of the team. Do you still have them in post, and how did you manage, because it's over and above their day jobs, I'm guessing? So I know you mentioned investment. Are you talking about investment for these roles? Just wondering how you're able to sustain the workforce that you needed to run this work.
Thanks, Joanne. And they're two really, really important things. So obviously we finished, and very quickly after that, if I'm right, there was Easter. We've had a discussion this week, and unfortunately one of our theatre driver, one of the members of staff had to go off sick, and a member of the family was very unwell. So we were able to replace them in the last week in one of the sites. We are, at the moment, we are in discussion to put that it was 10 o'clock. We have a daily regular SITREPS meeting, which is generally community and scheduled care in the health board. Certainly having a discussion with Keith around some of the battle rhythm stuff as well. Is that, do we look at that being part of that meeting, or is it much more localised from a theatres as in system perspective? So for us, we intend to put it back in. There is a discussion this afternoon about it, actually. I want it to go back in, albeit it might not be as wide as what it was when we were doing it before, because generally it was myself or our SDM for orthopedics who ran it. It was generally me. Well, the commitment to that is very big, isn't it? The theatre driver posts, the senior nurse managers, so the matrons or whatever else they call everybody. We need one more. We need one more. We're in a position that we can probably do some, as everybody does, tweaking and turning to try and get one more. And we got 4 sites with theatre complexes. And actually, if we can base them in those sites rather than them travelling everywhere, they could do it. The trouble is that when we start to factor in leave and we start to factor in they could be unwell. So underneath that, we need to make sure that the theatre coordinators are very strong in the role that they do. So it's not there right now, but the ambition is to put it back in, but also with some sort of support network under it. So that's where we are with the both issues, really.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks. And just leading on to that, it's important, isn't it, in terms of we've got rich data now. You've certainly got richer data than you had before. we've got the theatre optimisation data that is telling us a huge amount about the inefficiency that we've got within this system. And it is then empowering those people at whatever grade, whatever part of the cog that they are turning, it's empowering them so it becomes normal to be attaining this and to be able to flag up quickly and get decisions made quickly where things have done. And I think the work that you've done there in terms of understanding that and what's required, it is turning that into that norm, isn't it? And I think those conversations that you're having now are really good in terms of that. Karina, I can see you're on the call. I just wondered if you wanted to add anything to the from your perspective, and then I'll go to last questions.
Yeah, it's been a delight actually to work with the North and then to see how Hywel interpreted it, and both teams, oh my God, worked so hard, and it's slightly different things, but that really, really hard work gave amazing results for the patient. So I'm back to you cannot underestimate how hard people have worked to get to this point. And it's been quite exciting to watch people learn from each other. So well done to everyone who made that happen. It's my first thing. There's a couple of things that I would pick up from my perspective. Health boards have to make some really difficult decisions as they go through this, sometimes at quite a senior level, because to prioritise one thing, you've got to deprioritise something else. And we all know health boards are terrible at doing that because it's hard. So there has to be buy-in, literally from right at the exec, right the way down. Otherwise, I think people will get stuck. So that's one thing I would say. But more important than that is the clinical frontline teams have got to want to do it. And in both situations, so this was an idea that Wrexham came up with themselves. You know, it came from the Wrexham team, they came up with it themselves and then drove it forward. And similarly, the experience in Hywel is that it started with the surgeons, but then spread, but the teams wanted to do something. And then I think what I watched is Steph and Keith respond to help them do the something that they wanted. But my personal view is this isn't something you can enforce on a team. A team has got to want to do it. And the last thing is I think it would be different for every health board. I think there'll be loads of those common themes, as everyone said. Pre-op no doubt will come up everywhere, right? But again, I think the way that Wrexham, there was like a bed and a ring fencing issue, and Hywel there was a session issue. So if any other health board wants to take it forward, I think your teams will tell you and you will know what that needs to be. But just well done, everyone. Just again, I don't know how you shipped up every day and got it done, but you did.
Thanks, Karina. I've just asked Lisa in the chat bar, because the GIRFT input into these meetings at the elective optimisation are ending at the end of this month. We will continue with these sharing good practice events, and I'm thinking that because the anaesthetic STIN is new and given pre-assessment is a challenge across Wales, I'm thinking perhaps it would be a good audience for us to talk through what the priorities are that they are going to be working on, what that means for all Wales around pre-screening, pre-assessment, the questions that we're going to be asking. So I think for the next meeting, whether it's GIRFT organising it or us in the exec, I think having that lens on pre-assessment, pre-screening and the anaesthetic challenges we've got across Wales and how we work together to improve those and look to the optimum what we should be providing, then I think that might be helpful as well. So I'll leave that with me and I will sort that out. So thank you to Steph, Keith and all of the team and Karina that were involved in this. I'll just bring Paul in before I finish. Go on, Paul.
Thank you, Loretta. I wondered, so this is something we've been asked to look at by our executive board and Director of Plan Care. And I wondered, Stephanie, would you be happy to share that presentation, because you went through it so obviously there's so much information there. I'd really like to study that. And then obviously the whole point of these meetings and shared learning so that we can pick up where the weaknesses were and then come up with a plan to sort of mitigate that and work through it. But I'd be really grateful to be happy to share that.
Yeah, I mean, Lisa's, if Lisa can share it to the team on here, that's great. And Paul, if you want to meet up and have a chat, that's absolutely fine. I got no problem in doing that.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. That'll be great. I'll definitely be in touch.
Perfect.
Lovely.
That's great.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
So Lisa, if you don't mind sharing that with everyone on the call, and just say thank you really to Steph, Keith, Karina for coming today and talking about all the hard work that you've done. And that's great. So have a good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.